I want to welcome our friend Joe Pollak from Breitbart. We both crossed paths briefly in Israel, as a matter of fact. Joel, how are you, my friend?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm very well. You have a piece up at Breitbart, and I read it. And I want you to tell the American people what happened to you when you were trying to cover an event and what event that was. Go right ahead.
So I went down to UCLA here in Los Angeles to take a look at the pro-Palestinian encampment, as they call it, or the Palestine Solidarity Encampment that they set up there. And I brought my Breitbart News press credential, which I was wearing around my neck, and I wanted to be sure that people understood I was a journalist, and I thought I would just walk across the encampment and take some video so people could see what this was. And if you look online...
Now, let's hold on 1 minute. Were you wearing your kippah?
I was wearing a hat, so I didn't go there
Same thing.
Openly. Yeah, but I went there and began filming around the encampment. Now, what's really interesting is they set this encampment up and they surrounded it with plywood and scrap furniture, kind of like a barricade. And the university appears to have set up steel railings now around these barricades as if the university itself is closing off the encampment. There are entrances on two sides, and I went to the side that said media sign-in. So I went up to the people who were standing around that entrance. They were wearing bright fluorescent jerseys, and I said, I'm from the media. I want to sign in. I want to check in. I would like to visit the encampment. And there were other journalists around, not in the encampment, but on the stairs of nearby buildings, doing setup shots and things like that, taking photographs. And they told me there was nobody to talk to me right now, but maybe later. And I said, well, I'm just going to come and walk around for a couple of minutes. And they said, okay, but you have to wear a mask. So I said, okay, some people are hyper nervous about coronavirus. It later occurred to me that they're all wearing these coronavirus masks to try to hide their identities. But anyway, I put the mask on. I started walking around inside and filming. And all of a sudden I was confronted by these activists who started holding up their keffiyehs to try to prevent me from filming. Now, this is a public university, and it's a public square in the public university. I have as much right to be there as they do. And they started saying, you're violating the rules of the encampment. I said, well, the rules of the encampment are the United States Constitution, and I have a First Amendment right as a journalist to be here and to document what's going on. And they tried to stop me. They tried to obstruct me. Eventually, they linked arms, and collectively, about a dozen of them started pushing and shoving me toward the gate to push me back out. And it's very clear that they are doing this. One woman even says, okay, now push. And that's assault. That's just common assault. And I got to the outside. I let them push me, although I stood my ground. I didn't make it easy for them, but I didn't push back too hard. Or at all, really. I just let them push me. And I get to the outside, and there are a phalanx of journalists photographing and filming what's happening, standing outside the encampment. So I turned to the journalist and I said, how do you let this happen? This is a public square. This is a public university. All of you should be in there taking photographs and filming, and you're letting them push you around. These are undergraduates who are violating the law. They're violating the Constitution. And you have a First Amendment right to be there, just like I do, and we should be showing the American people what this is about. So what I learned today is that it's not about the Palestinians. It's not about the Middle East. This is about an attempt to overthrow our American values. They say they're for freedom for the Palestinians. They're against freedom for Americans. How is it that our public universities and private, but especially the public ones, have allowed these kids to set up barricades and to exclude members of the public and members of the media as if they own that space, as if they have the right or some kind of permission to do that? They're there illegally. They're violating the civil rights of everybody on that campus. And the university is allowing this to go on. And that's what's happening. This is not about anything positive for the Palestinians. There were hateful slogans there, some of the usual rhetoric that you see. But more immediately, it's just a violation of our rights as Americans to be treated this way. And the universities are allowing it to happen.
The universities are allowing it to happen, and so is the federal government. There's a lot of federal money that flows into these universities, and Joe Biden doesn't really even talk about it. Isn't that problematic, too?
Well, you know who's also very silent? Merrick Garland is silent, and Kristen Clark, who's the head of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, is silent. Now, there's a Department of Education Office of Civil Rights that is investigating some of these universities. But as you've documented and talked about repeatedly on your show, this is not just a problem of universities. These protests are funded and organized by national and sometimes international organizations. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division should be investigating these organizations and these networks and all the people who fund them because they are violating the civil rights of journalists. They're violating the civil rights of Jewish students at Columbia and other campuses, at UCLA, where Jewish students feel intimidated. And they're violating the civil rights of Americans. You can't close off a public square and physically exclude people from being in there. You know, the funniest part of the whole thing, aside from the kind of hippie music that was being played the entire time, kind of like a Woodstock sort of vibe, the funniest thing was as they're pushing me, they're shouting, peaceful protest, peaceful protest. These are not peaceful protests. If you're excluding people by force, that is violence.
You know, Joe Pollak, Jake Tapper and these other people, this is mostly peaceful, they say. Well, to the Jewish students on these campuses, it's not mostly peaceful, it's terrorizing. And many of them have been victimized, and many of them can't go to their graduation ceremonies, can't finish their classes, can't wear their symbols that they wear on their bodies, can't do a whole lot of things. Do you think part of the problem is the way the media cover this, whether it's CNN or MSNBC or the rest of them?
The media are covering these protests as if they're pro-Palestinian protests. They're not also covering the fact that they are excluding Jewish students from Columbia. They're excluding journalists from encampments just about everywhere. They're not covering their own suppression. I mean, the journalists are being physically barred entry to public spaces, violating their First Amendment rights, and they're not telling the American people that this is what's happening. That's not a peaceful protest. A peaceful protest respects the rights of other people to have their point of view, to exercise their freedom of assembly, their freedom of the press. These kids want their view to be the only view. That's why they set up these encampments. That's why they set up barricades. That's why they have to use violence to keep people out. You know, what's interesting, Mark, as a journalist, I'm sure you get these pitches all the time. I get pitches from people all the time who want me to cover their protest or their idea. This is the opposite. These kids don't want journalists to cover what they're talking about, what they're saying to each other, what their posters say, what they're writing in Arabic sometimes. They don't want people to know their real views. They just want to be able to have this symbolic confrontation with authority. And they're winning in a lot of places because the university administrators and faculty share these students' radical beliefs. They're just sitting in air-conditioned offices and they have tenure and they don't want to lose their jobs or their comforts. But the students are doing what the professors have taught them to do. Across from the encampment at UCLA, there were some employees of UCLA holding a banner that said, faculty and staff support UCLA students. And I asked them, do you support them using violence to exclude members of the media? And they said, well, they don't have a position on that. And they said they're just there to prevent the students from being arrested. But the students are committing crimes, and they're violating university policies, they're violating California state law, they're violating the U.S. Constitution. So the faculty and staff are not all, but are generally supportive of these students and opposed to any attempt to enforce not just the law, but basic fairness. You can't take over part of a university and exclude people who have different views or who just want to go about their business from entering that space. These kids don't want to debate. They don't want to engage. They don't want publicity for what they really believe. They just want the fight. And they're willing to use violence. And they're very well trained. I heard them say to each other, link arms, which meant that they had drilled for this. They had practiced it. Somebody had taught them how to do this. And they surrounded me, and with their arms linked, they pushed. And, you know, it was like a rugby game where you have the scrum, and everybody's pushing in one direction. Of course, I'm just standing there, and even though I'm 180 pounds and I'm in pretty good shape, I can't stop 12 people, and they just pushed me, and I basically let them do it. But that's not a peaceful protest. That's not what we should be teaching kids about free speech and debate. They're not interested in debate. They can't debate, and they don't want you to photograph their sign. I mean, some of them are the usual funny ones like Queers for Palestine, as if Hamas treats gay kids or gay people with any kind of respect. But there are other ones that call for the elimination of Israel, and apparently, I didn't confirm this myself, but I've seen other photographs of signs in Arabic that apparently say that they want to bomb Tel Aviv. So they don't want you to see that part of it, and they can't defend what they're doing. They just want this confrontation, and they want to be able to push the university administration around and win concessions. And the sad thing is they're winning at a lot of these places. Columbia gave the students a midnight deadline to clear out their encampment last night. Midnight came and went. They backed away from the deadline, and now they're negotiating over whether they're going to divest from Israel or whatever. They're rewarding violent behavior, and that's why it continues.
In the few minutes I have left here, Joel Pollak, the International Criminal Court apparently is on the precipice of issuing an arrest warrant against the Prime Minister of Israel and top officials in the Israeli government. The Biden administration has been absolutely silent, which tells me that they're the invisible hand in part that's behind this. And I believe if this is done, it's going to set off a wave throughout Europe and elsewhere of even further dangerous, violent anti-Semitism, because now we will have this so-called international court making a finding without even taking any evidence. It doesn't need evidence. We know what it's up to. Aren't you astonished that it's basically just Republicans in Congress who are objecting to this, not Democrats in Congress and not this administration?
That is astonishing, but it's not entirely unexpected. Some of these radical protesters surrounded Chuck Schumer's house in Brooklyn earlier this week, and he was the one who called for unleashing the whirlwind against the Supreme Court justices. So they do this kind of thing. They unleash the mobs, they unleash the hate, they unleash the International Criminal Court, and they don't realize they're going to get the same treatment in the end. One of the reasons the United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has refused to join the International Criminal Court is because it could go after American soldiers, American servicemen and servicewomen, for whatever some rogue nation decides is a war crime as we're overseas fighting against terrorists. And the United States understands full well that we would be dragged, or our soldiers would be dragged defenseless in front of these international tribunals by rogue nations, by the Russias and Irans of the world. The UN has a habit of putting Iran in charge of things like women's rights and disarmament and things like that. So we don't trust these international institutions, and we shouldn't. But what the Biden administration doesn't seem to understand is that what goes around comes around. And when they talk about sanctioning units of the Israeli military, and when they talk about allowing the International Criminal Court to pursue Israeli officials for entirely lawful actions, it's going to come to us. Now, Donald Trump stood up to these people, and he said any member of the International Criminal Court who investigates American servicemen and servicewomen is going to have sanctions placed on them, and they're going to be denied visas and entry into this country. But Biden reversed that, and he has definitely taken a different approach to the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, and they are definitely playing footsie with these institutions. And they're putting all of us at risk, because if our soldiers and our sailors and Marines can't defend us, and they have to face the judgment of these international institutions that are so corrupt, then we're all going to be less safe.
It's so contemptible, so diabolical what's going on here, that we have this international court, and it'll be used by all the Jew haters and anti-Semites all over Europe, all over the world, as some kind of an official certification that the prime minister is a criminal, that his government's criminal, and that the state of Israel's criminal, war criminals. And the idea, and I believe the invisible hand of the Biden administration has a role in this, because they won't speak out against it, is so contemptible. Did you ever imagine that you'd have an American administration that almost daily finds a reason to trash the state of Israel while it's funding Iran and its Islamist terrorist surrogate groups? Did you ever imagine something like this?
Well, we saw some foreshadowing of it with Barack Obama, who, especially in the last lame duck weeks of his presidency, tried to declare the Jewish presence in Jerusalem, which goes back millennia, tried to declare it illegal at the United Nations. So we saw some inkling of it. But now, under the Biden administration, the same junior officials in the shadows who made those kinds of decisions, they're back and they're in charge, and they're doing exactly the same thing, allowing these horrific resolutions to pass at the United Nations. And once in a while, they stand up for what's right, because Israel basically says, you can't do this to us without undermining your own security. And, you know, they hate it when Netanyahu goes on TV here because he's so good at making the arguments that the American public wakes up and says, wait a minute, what's going on here? But it is astonishing. And what's even worse, again, is that
I've
the
got
Biden
1 minute.
administration doesn't understand that Hamas is not just about attacking Israel. They killed Americans on October 7th. They have American hostages now as we speak. And Biden has given up on them. He is not defending Americans.
All right, my friend. Fantastic job. It was good seeing you at the airport, Tel Aviv, and keep up the great work. We always enjoy reading it at Breitbart.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for everything you do, and thanks to the listeners.
There you go. That's Joel Pollak. He's one of the greats, really. Great independent journalists.